Thank you all for joining me, everyone. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Ron Levine from Mindfulness and Blue Jeans. I've been practicing mindfulness and insight meditation for almost 25 years and was introduced to the practice during a time when I was dealing with clinical anxiety and depression and panic disorder. And my panic disorder had blown up into agoraphobia. So I was on disability. I was unable to leave the house. My life had effectively stopped. And I was fortunate enough to be paired up with a psychologist who, even back in 1998, was already several decades deep into practicing and teaching mindfulness and insight meditation, long before they became mainstream. And they have been the cornerstone of my recovery. My life as it is, and as it has been for the last couple of decades, I owe to these practices of mindfulness and insight meditation. And now I like to offer the tools and techniques and the practices that have helped me so much and continue to help me, and offer them to others as well. I think it was Ram Dass that said we're all just walking each other home, right? So it's about helping each other out. So I like to offer these weekly sessions, this ongoing series I call Calming Anxiety by Living Mindfully, and offering a different tool, tip, technique each time. And some of them may resonate, some of them may not. As they say, you can take the best and leave the rest, right? So let's jump in with today's, okay? I always like to begin my sitting by imagining that I am suspended from the ceiling by a piece of string attached to the top of my head, as a nice cue to sit up straight without adding any extra tension to do so. If there is some tension right now, that is fine. That is completely fine. Often we try to get rid of tension when we find that we have some. And how do we usually do that? Usually by trying to force it away somehow, which is what? Adding tension to the tension we already have. I've never found that to be very effective, very useful, very skillful. So if I find that I have some tension, mentally, physically, emotionally, I just notice, okay, there's some tension here. It's allowed to be here. It's allowed to leave in its own time. That may or may not be today. And I also like to notice what is beneath me, what is supporting me. The floor, chair, cushion. Something is holding me up. And I can allow it to do so. Let's take a moment to notice this grounding beneath us, and this gentle lift at the top. And whatever else happens to be in between the two for us right now, however it is. And if you haven't already, you may begin to bring your attention to your breathing. You may find that you begin to shape or control your breathing as soon as you bring your attention to it. Perhaps because we think it needs to be a certain way for our practice. Perhaps we're just accustomed to interacting with the breathing that way. I've always found it very helpful to try to just watch the breathing as it is. When I don't interfere. When I don't try to control or shape it. I usually end up finding that even when I think I'm not controlling it, I start to notice, oh, there is still some shaping and controlling going on here, just at a more subtle level than I was able to notice before. And I noticed that as well. We don't have to try to force ourselves to stop controlling the breathing. That's just adding tension to tension again, right? Trying to controlling. So we don't have to do that. If there's controlling, if there's shaping, we can notice the controlling and the shaping. We're gathering information. What's happening here right now? Now, several years ago, I was leading a workshop one day, and I had a question from one of the attendees. He says, I've been trying to practice mindfulness lately, awareness, but I'm not really sure what the point is. I said, well, can you give me an example of when you were doing it? He says, sure. He says, yesterday I was brushing my teeth, getting ready to go to work. And I just really paid attention to the process of brushing my teeth. The feeling of the brush, the motion of my hand, the taste of the toothpaste. Just really paid attention to that. Said, okay. What would you have been doing otherwise? He said, well, usually I'm worrying about work or thinking about what I have to do that day or thinking about a meeting or thinking about how late I am, worried about the traffic. I said, oh, okay. I said, so of the two of them, which one was the more pleasant experience? He says, well, the one where I wasn't worrying and anticipating everything. I said, that's the point. That's the point. Right? We're here to learn how to decrease our suffering, to get out of our own way. Now, sometimes we may have these grand plans of enlightenment, nirvana, right? These sorts of things. That's fine. But as I said at the beginning, I was housebound. I was on disability. My life had stopped when I was introduced to this practice. For me, just being able to go out and work again was enough. Yeah? I'll take that. Right? How's my day-to-day experience? If I take care of my experience right now, well, what is life but just a succession of nows? But he brought up something that resonated deeply with me, which was this anticipation. For me, this is certainly a huge component of anxiety, is this anticipation. And what I've found is the anticipation, more than being a cause of anxiety per se, really adds fear to the anxiety. I often like to say that fear requires imagination. We don't really fear what is happening to us in the moment because it's happening. We're dealing with it in the now. For me, fear has always been more about how am I going to be able to handle that thing in the future? Like our friend who was worried about work and the commute and so forth. I've found that I can feel anxiety in the present, but fear is in the future. And for me, being very visual, the form that usually takes is mental images. I'll get that frozen mental image of the worst case nightmare scenario and get stuck on that. Sometimes it's even about anxiety in itself. Like I could be experiencing anxiety in the present, but be generating fear about how much anxiety I might be feeling in the future. Oh, if I'm feeling this much now, how much worse is it going to be when I have to do that thing? Right? That's a classic suffering line of thinking. We're experiencing some pain in the form of anxiety, and we're adding suffering in the form of fear on top of it. And fear and anxiety together are a hell of a combination. So I might try to stop visualizing that mental image, that frozen nightmare scenario, but it just kind of keeps coming back, doesn't it? So rather than fighting my visual sense, I simply find a new way to work with it. Something that I see sometimes is my own hand reaching out and taking hold of this frozen mental image as if it was a picture or a movie cell. I can hold it up to the light. I can turn it on its side, see there's no depth to it. I can anchor on the breathing and notice this picture for the picture that it is. It's not reality, it's a representation of a storyline. Like any picture, I can manipulate it, look at it from different angles. Can step back from it. Look at it from further away, or I can step in closer and zoom in on a particular part of it. Oh, what's over here? What's over here? And we might find that, well, geez, our attention is moving. That's a living, actual thing happening here, but maybe the image isn't. And if the image is static, well, then obviously it's not reality, because reality is not static. But if we find that the picture is perhaps also moving as we are examining it, well, then it's no longer a frozen nightmare scenario, is it? It's moving. It's processing. It's impermanent. Perhaps you have a mental picture. And if you do, you might take a few moments. Anchor on the breathing. Notice it as the picture that it is. And see what happens. When you treat it as a picture. And one of the challenges here, of course, is continuing to notice it as a picture and not getting stuck in the storylines and narratives about it. That'll take time. That'll take practice. That's why we're doing this. That's why we're here now. So we notice if we fall into the narrative, into the storyline, and we bring our focus back to the breathing and to this picture as nothing but a picture. Perhaps one we've seen hundreds of times. As my first teacher told me years ago, the map is not the territory. These mental pictures are an attempt to make a map. So that we'll feel safe when it comes time to traverse the territory. But in order to be safe, we have to be ready for the worst case scenario, right? So we make our map as scary as possible, just in case. And how's that working out for us? That's suffering. That's adding fear. Nothing wrong with being prepared, but badgering ourselves relentlessly with the worst what-ifs. Is that helpful? Is that keeping us safe? Or is it just making us miserable? When we can see these maps, these pictures, as the ephemeral representations that they actually are, of scenarios that may or may not ever arise. And we see how we're creating them and why. We can begin to gain a little space. Start to become disillusioned. Literally not buying into these illusions as much. And ironically, it ends up making for a much more pleasant journey across that territory. And this is how we walk the path. Thank you, everyone. I'll hang on for a few minutes if we have some things in the chat, if anyone would like to ask or share anything. Yeah, Farnaz. Feeling guilty for thinking the worst. So it's funny how it layers on itself, isn't it? We are trying to keep ourselves safe. We overdo it and generate fear on top of anxiety that may already be there. And then I may feel guilt about doing that. May feel, for me, it was more depression. There are these collections of emotional processes that have a way of generating each other or calling each other in. Like I always say in these sessions, karma, cause and effect. It's classic cause and effect. So we want to see, well, okay, what causes and conditions can I change to get some better effects? And for me, step one is getting the lay of the land. Say, okay, what am I doing here? And what is here? And what am I doing with it? And that's really just observing the processes that are coming up and how they're related to each other. What process is creating that process and what process is an effect of that process. And simply seeing, oh, okay, I'm thinking worst case scenarios and here's what's happening. Here's what's resulting from that. And seeing that come up again and again and again to the point where we really start to recognize not just, and we know intellectually that this isn't helping. We know that. If that was enough to solve this whole issue, we wouldn't be here right now, right? So that's not the problem. The problem isn't that we don't know this. The problem is we're not feeling this. Like I always say, the hot potato effect. Someone hands you a hot potato. You don't think, should I drop this? It's burning my hand. You just drop it. There's a felt sense there. There's a sensational intelligence. And it's only through the continued seeing of this process that it starts to filter down to that level. And once we start to see the interrelationships between these processes at that level, we start to just drop the stuff as naturally as the hot potato. We don't have to tell ourselves, oh, I should really stop doing this. It just kind of happens. That's been my experience. So the challenge is observing these processes of how we are creating our own suffering again and again and again until we really become disillusioned with them. Realize, oh, I'm doing this because I think I'm going to get that benefit, but instead I keep getting that pain, that suffering. Once you start to see that at that subconscious, that sensational, that felt level, I've found it just stops. It just stops. But it's good that you're noticing that relationship. Like the guilt one, I don't know that I've ever had that. Like I say, for me, it would be maybe more depression, maybe more frustration. Guilt, that's a different experience than mine. And it's an insight right there that you have noticed, oh, this is part of my experience. I'm doing this and I'm getting that. That guilt is an effect, but it's also a cause for what may come next. So we want to see, what can I change in this process? And really, in the early stages, the changing is simply the observation in itself, because that's different than what we're doing, right? We can't be creating these mental pictures of nightmare scenarios and be observing the process of us doing that at the same time. So simply by engaging in this observation, in this inquiry, that is a change in the causes and conditions. And we do that for a while and we see, okay, what's the effect? Like my friend with the toothbrushing. Now, what's the effect of paying attention to brushing my teeth? Well, I'm not sitting and worrying about meetings and traffic and work and so forth. Well, which one's better? Okay. That's enough. That's enough. Ren, that's why I'm afraid to go out. I believe I won't handle it. Yes. You just summed up my agoraphobia days. That's exactly it. there's the anxiety that we're feeling in the moment, but then there's the fear coming from the storyline of, well, how much anxiety am I going to be feeling then? What's going to happen then? And we get stuck on that frozen mental image. And I'll say this very briefly because this gets into like a separate session that I do sometimes. But one of the things that my psychologist in the early days took me through was getting me past the mental image. A little different than what we did today, where we were just kind of holding it up and checking it out. But there's another stage where we then start to look past it. I said to him one day, he said to me, if you didn't have agoraphobia right now, what would you do? And being here in the Massachusetts area, I said to him, I'd go into Harvard Square, which back in the 90s was a much cooler place than it is now. But we had a bunch of record stores and so forth. And he says, why don't you go to Harvard Square? I said, I can't go to Harvard Square. I'd have a panic attack. He says, understand, extremely uncomfortable experience, scary, not discounting that at all. But then what? I said to him, what then what? What do you mean? I just said, dude, panic attack. Hello? He says, I understand. Not taking anything away from that. But then what? And he just shut up. He was going to make me talk next. And I thought about the times I'd had panic attacks or near panic attacks and so forth, and eventually had to admit, well, at some point, I guess it would stop. Because it always had before. I'm still here, right? He said, yeah. At some point, it would stop. And that was the point I had not been able to get to. I got stuck on that mental image, that frozen mental image of the nightmare scenario at its peak. Saw that and said, oh, hell no. But like anything else, even a panic attack is made up of processes, causes and effects that aren't any more permanent or substantial than anything else. Did I immediately go out running to Harvard Square? No, of course not. I still had to work my way up to doing things like that. I had to practice with it, so I had it at a felt level. The subconscious had a chance to sink in. Chris, yes, the polar bear. I always call it the pink elephant effect. Yeah. No quicker way to be obsessed with something than to try to stop thinking about it. So that's why I look for an alternate route. Okay, trying not to think about this doesn't work. I have a strong visual sense, which is why these mental images are so strong. How else can I use my visual sense rather than trying to clamp down on it? How can I use it differently? Use it to my advantage. Because it's an advantage of strong visual sense. Okay, yeah, that's an advantage. I can use that. Why am I trying to stamp it out? How do I take this thing that I'm using unskillfully and still use it? Don't try to stop using it. If you have a hammer and you're hitting yourself in the hand with a hammer, you realize, okay, I don't want to hit myself in the hand with a hammer. It doesn't mean you never use a hammer again. If you got a nail somewhere you're going to bang in, you're going to need that hammer. How do I skillfully use this tool rather than trying to just pretend it doesn't exist, right? Except from Paris, feeling depression, wondering when I'm going to be able to move on with my life, not staying stuck in all this insanity. So there are a couple of things here. What I've found is the framing is very important. For me, I have found that it's a suffering line of thinking to view negative states, what we consider negative states, depression, anxiety, and so forth, to view them as getting in the way of moving on with life, getting in the way of living. In that moment, they are part of my life. They are what I'm living. We often run into a classic suffering line of thinking in this practice itself, mindfulness, insight meditation, where if we are noticing that we are constantly distracted by a certain thought, some kind of recurring thinking or something, and get very upset and say, no, I'm meditating. My mind's supposed to be blank. I'm supposed to be relaxed. This is getting in the way of my meditation. No, it's not. It is your meditation. It's what you came to see. This is what's happening. We came to see what's happening and what we're doing with it. Well, what's happening? These thought lines I think I shouldn't be having. What am I doing with it? Thinking I shouldn't be having it. How's that working out for me? Miserable experience. Okay. So, what can we try instead? Well, this thing keeps coming up. Maybe I should listen to it. Oh, I don't want to listen to it. Okay, notice that you don't want to listen to it. These are all just processes. They're what's here now. Naturally, when we feel something that is painful, like depression or anxiety, just like with a physical pain, we want to just get rid of it. And the more we want to just get rid of it, the more we notice it ain't going away. And so we try harder to get rid of it, and it sticks around. And we think of it as being in the way. And in that moment, it's not in the way. It's the way. So the question becomes, okay, this is what's here. What am I doing with it? Trying to push it away? How's that working out for me? Ugh. Does that mean that if we start to listen to it and start to open up to it, it's just going to magically go away? Maybe, maybe not. We can't open up to it with that sly intention of, okay, I'm going to start listening to you, but just so you go away. Doesn't work that way. But, again, what is this practice about? Alleviating our suffering. If we're experiencing some kind of emotional pain, in my experience, trying to squelch it, trying to stamp it out, trying to push it away, that adds suffering. An unwillingness to experience that process and the discomfort or pain that may come with it, that's what causes the suffering. And we do that because we think it's going to work. It's going to get us to a place where we don't have to feel it anymore. Does it happen that way? Not in my experience. Now we just have the initial pain and suffering on top of it now. So for me, I've come to reframe these states and say, this is not getting in the way of something. It may not be what I wanted. Yeah, I'm not denying that it's unpleasant. I'm simply acknowledging its unpleasantness in a way that is not aggressive. Because really, what are these things but just us? These are all part of us. And the first insight I ever had in this practice was, if you fight yourself, you've already lost. Because that's what I'd been doing for years, and what ultimately destroyed me was fighting myself. An inner civil war. You can't win that. How can you possibly? So when something comes up that is unpleasant, I've found that the worst thing I can do is try to use some of my other energy trying to fight that energy. Yeah, between Ren and Farnaz with the cycle of and that's just it, these cycles. Depression, anxiety. As I often say, emotions have a way of begetting themselves. We don't just feel sad, we'll feel sad about feeling sad. We don't just feel happy, we'll feel happy about feeling happy. Feel angry about feeling angry. Feel anxious about feeling anxiety. Feel depressed about feeling depression. These are all processes. And one of the things that in itself is a cycle is, as humans, we don't like uncertainty, because where there's uncertainty, there could be danger. So we don't like things that are unfamiliar. And as I was saying a moment ago, when we're experiencing something unpleasant, we just want to get rid of it. We don't get to know it. So we never get familiar with what it's really like. And if we're not familiar with what it's really like, but we also don't like uncertainty, well, how do we deal with that? We try to fill in the gaps of uncertainty with our own storylines. Which storylines are those? The worst case scenario ones, just in case. All right? So you see what we're doing ourselves. We're keeping ourselves unfamiliar with what's actually here, and then trying to fill in the gaps of our ignorance about what it is because we're not getting familiar with it, and filling it in with stuff that's far worse, usually, than what's actually here. So this process of opening up a bit, gaining some familiarity. As we gain some familiarity, we feel a little less uncertainty. It may not be pleasant, but it's like, okay, this sucks, but I now know how it sucks. Okay? And then we're not generating worst case scenarios. And that's how we begin to shift a cycle of ignorance to a cycle of knowledge, and ultimately a cycle of wisdom. Again, changing those causes and conditions, because these vicious cycles came from causes and conditions as well. And usually those causes and conditions are largely made up of us trying to stop the cycle, but we're not doing it skillfully. So that's what we're doing in this practice, is seeing clearly what we're doing with what's coming up, saying, okay, that's not working. What can I change here? Yeah, I'll close with this because we're running a little long, but feeling like ours is the worst, right? There's this old saying, don't compare your inside to other people's outside. And I like to say even more specifically, because we don't really know what other people's outside is. Don't compare your inside with your perception of other people's outsides. If there is one thing that I have found in talking with people, teaching people, running sessions like these for years, again and again and again, we all feel like we're the only one. We all have that nagging feeling that everybody else has their shit together, except us. I'll let you in on a little secret if it helps. Me too. Me too. It's okay. It's okay. It's part of this human experience. It's another process. It's allowed. It's allowed to be here. It has its function. It's also trying to keep us safe. It wants us to be happy. So the freedom isn't a freedom from having that feeling. It's the freedom of having that feeling and saying, hey, what's up? And even having gratitude for it. Because, again, it's just trying to help. It's just trying to help. Speaking of which, I hope that helps. I'll wrap it up there. We're running a little bit long, but I hope this was helpful for some of you. Cheers, everybody. Thank you all so much. Take care.